All right, so I now want to introduce Jai and Eric. They're going to be giving a very interesting talk about using Apple's new unified logging mechanism to find bad guys or bad girls. So without any further ado, let's give them a round of warm welcome and hand it over to you all.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Dr. C, and everyone who helps organize this conference and get us here. We're excited to share our research and be here with all of you. So we're talking about finding Waldo in the Apple Unified Blog. Before you advance, there's no picture of Waldo there. It's really tempting because the badge says we're just finding Waldo, so it's going to bring us to the book and we're going to pick it out. But yeah, we're going to actually talk about Mac forensics. So go ahead and just go kind of cover the agenda here. So we're going to introduce ourselves, introduce Unified Blog, talk a little about why we're here. Don't worry, it's not an existential discussion. It's actually talking about forensics. Then we're going to talk about acquiring the log, parsing it, and then finally finding Waldo or finding evil, and just wrap things up after that. So a little bit about myself. My name is Musunuri. I'm principal consultant with CrowdStrike's professional services team. I lead our Mac OS forensics and incident response practice. Certified black belt examiner and work on non-active. I'm in our Singapore office, so if you see me yawning or drinking a lot of coffee, it's because it's 4 a.m. right now in Singapore. So, but you know, the presentation excites me, so I'll try my best to stay awake.
Hey everybody, I'm Eric Martin. I'm an associate consultant with CrowdStrike Services. Primarily, I work on the incident response side, but I also help assist tabletop exercises, red team, blue team as well. I help develop the automatic tool that we use, and we'll have a presentation on that in a little bit. And then also, I'm a certified black belt examiner. Thank you, Sarah Edwards, by the way, for helping keep developing great tools.
All right. So why we're here, once again, if you want to have an existential crisis, you're free to, but we're going to talk about incident response and why we're looking at Unified Blog and why this is so important to us. So the analogy I like to give is when we do incident response, we're putting out fires. We're like firefighters. And when we approach a situation when the so-called house is on fire, let's say our customers in network computing environment, what we're going in there is we're going in there with the right tools. We want to make sure we have the right tools, the right knowledge, and the right capabilities to understand what's going on and figure out and basically put out this fire. If you're a firefighter, you gotta have the fire truck, you gotta hoses, protective gear, and the knowledge about how to deal with it. When it comes to incident response, what we need is we have to know the right artifacts, we need to know how to use them, we need to know how to acquire them, but we need to know what tools can help us get to that point. So the reason this is relevant to this talk is we're not necessarily going deep as part of the internals of the log. What we really want to show in this presentation is understanding what's the right data, how do we parse it, how do we allocate good data, and how do we use that to really put out this fire. So like I said, what we're discussing is how can we leverage the Apple Unified Log to improve our incident response efforts. When we do incident response on Mac OS systems, we're using a variety of forensic artifacts and sources, more than just the log. But those of you who have done incident response, even on Windows or Linux or any other platform, are probably well aware that logging is, and logs in general, are a fantastic source of forensic information, help reconstruct timelines of attacks, understand intrusions, and understand what bad guys did on the system. So that's our primary focus here. But to get to that point, we also need to talk about the internals of the log, how to get it, and then how to parse it and to put it into a format that works to do analysis and works to get those answers to put out the fire. So to kick it off, I'm going to hand this over to Eric, who's going to, well, one more thing. I don't know if you guys have seen this scheme before, but just reiterate my previous point. When we get to incident response, the house is on fire, the logs are really what save us. We're trying to do forensic analysis. It's great that you have these other tools to get visibility or data as you go through during an incident or pre-incident, but if the house is on fire, we need the logs. So I'm going to hand it over to Eric, who's going to go over for the introduction to Unified Log and talk about a few topics here.
Thank you, Ben. So as Jake kind of mentioned, this is going to be a very high-level overview of the Unified Log. We're not going to do that deep level, that deep dive analysis of the Unified Log, just what we as forensicators need to know in order to get what we want. If you are looking for that deep dive analysis, again, Eclectic Light Flow at Howard Oakley has a great blog, and so I recommend you go check that out. So what is the purpose of the unified log? By a brief show of hands, who here has ever used the unified log for any reason? Okay, who here has no clue what it is? Okay, cool. So the unified log is Apple's new logging format. It was introduced at WWDC back in 2016. Now, after watching the actual reveal, the primary objective of the unified log from Apple's perspective was to give developers a much easier time going through their logs to find any bugs or issues with their code. So that's great, but from a security standpoint, not exactly ideal. However, there are still security events that we can go and pull. Now, with this one single logging mechanism, that does provide a couple of benefits in terms of time, at least for developers. They can go through and find those errors very quickly. It did replace a couple of old Unix logs, such as the syslog. Now, this Apple new edition of the unified log, it is standard across all Apple devices, which is nice. So if you are trying to debug both Mac and iOS, you can find all your errors in the same location, in the same structure. And that's of those devices that are included are Mac OS, iOS, watchOS, and tvOS. So this new format that Apple introduced, it is no longer in plain text like some of the old previous logs were, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. On the good side, the positive side, the pros, you get much more data because it is now in a compressed format, in what Apple calls its trace-v3 file. On the con side, though, is that you can no longer go in and just grep through all that data. You have to now mold it and parse that data either through third parties, which Jay will discuss later, or through Apple's included log command. So where is the unified log, and what does the unified log log? So we'll start where it's located. You can find it in the var.db directory. Now there's two different locations for the unified log. It's not in this one big gigantic file. It's actually a subset of a bunch of different files. So in your diagnostics, that's where you have your trace-v3 files, and then your UUID text directory, you have a lot of your supporting files. Now, when Apple released the unified log, again, as I mentioned, it was centered around developers. And so what they implemented were these new categories, the subsystem and category as well. So your subsystem, an example of that might be com.apple.objective by the C. So you might have a bunch of processes running from there. And you can go and differentiate different logs that originate via category. So you can have categories such as conference_production or conference_tests. And different logs can be generated from those different categories, which is great for the developer standpoint. From the security standpoint, we can use that. It's not as beneficial as you would think, though. Now, each log is determined, has a specific level that is determined by the API that is used. So there are 5 basic logs we're going to discuss today. There is a 6th that we've noticed, and that's the activity, but we're not going to focus on that for now. So those 3 basic logs that you have are default, info, and debug. And then you have your special levels, which are your error and your fault logs. Now, it's important to differentiate these because not all logs get logged the same way. Now, you have your default, your error, and your fault logs that are always enabled by default. And you have the destination as on disk. Now, what that means is every time a log type of default, error, or fault is generated, that's always going to be written to disk. Now, in info, if you look at the table that we have, you'll see it is enabled by default, but it's written to memory. I'll get what I mean by that on the next slide, but it's not always written to disk, so you're not always going to find all of those info logs in the trace-v3 files. And then your debug logs, those are disabled by default. Now, you can go in and change some of these settings via different profiles if you so choose. So how does the unified log work from more of an architectural standpoint? So we're going to start with process A. Now, this could be any process. It could be QuickTime, it could be SSH, doesn't matter. But that process is going to generate logs. Now, those logs are going to first go to the compressor. And from there, they're going to be compressed down into this buffer. Now, the API is going to look through this list of logs and determine what level they are. Now, if they're default or error or fault, those ones that automatically are enabled and get written to disk, automatically going to go to that compressed log file. Now, if it's that info, like I mentioned, that gets written to memory.
So that's going to go to the memory-only buffer. And now the way this works is all those info logs are going to be in memory until that last info log that comes through. At that point, that last info log then gets logged in with the rest of the compressed files. And that helps reduce some of the clutter that you might see with a lot of these info logs. Now you can also view these logs live with the log stream command. And you'll use the diagnostic D, that's the separate format. And just as an overall, all this is done by the log D daemon. So how are the unified logs structured? And then what do we as forensicators use in those logs that are helpful to us? Well, the log's broken down into log fields. Starting in Sierra, when the unified log was first released, there were only 16 log fields, and that has grown to 27 now in Catalina. Now, these log fields are very useful to us. This is how we parse through the data and look for things of interest to us. Now, there are three common fields that I want to touch on, and that is the date and time, the process, and the message fields. And I'll have an example on the next slide of breaking those down. But as forensicators, what we like to do is get what's called quick wins. And so we use those three fields to really get the most data without wasting too much time going through some of those additional fields. Additionally, there are signposts that Apple released in High Sierra. Now, those are primarily used for developers, but they do help us from an incident standpoint in that we can see process execution and say, oh, this process or this application was run. So this is an example of a unified log entry, as you can see through the console application. So right now, I'm only showing those three log fields that are of interest to us. So we'll start with the process. If you can see that in blue, the process that we're seeing right now is the sharing D. Now this could be useful. That's the sharing D is indicated, or screen sharing D is indicative of screen sharing on the system. So if we were to see this in the wild, we might ask the user, hey, do you use screen sharing? If that's a no, that's already a great indicator that something's malicious or something's not right. And from there, we'll transition to the time and date, and we'll get that time frame of interest, and we can expand and work our way from around there. And lastly, that message field that we have really gives us some insight into what occurred. So to break it down a little further, and we have a successful authentication. There is a username field in that message type, but there is nothing there, unfortunately. But we do have the IP address that screen sharing came from, which is extremely useful because then we can see that lateral movement. And then last, we have the type, which is what exactly occurred. And that is a guest request for control. Now, this message is pretty much unique just to the screen sharing D. There's going to be different data per each type of process message. This is just use an example. Now, again, I mentioned there's 27 other types of log fields. Not all log fields are going to be populated with data. But in this case, if you look down below the all messages time option, you can see that there is subsystem and category, which are blank. Your activity ID is 0, and your thread ID and PID are also there. So if we wanted to take a deeper dive, we could use that and try and correlate some of those processes. I'm going to hand it over to Jay. He's going to talk about the different types of logs.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So like Eric previously mentioned, Mac was using a series of different logs in the past. And as we've gone through our incident response investigations over the years, we've noticed that the unified log has a lot more data for us to parse through. So the unified log, generally looking at about 28 to 30 days of retention on a heavily used system. On some less used systems, we've seen weeks and months. And what we're looking at from this heavily used system is about 30 to 50 million records, comprising about 400 to 800 megs of data on the log archive. And Eric's going to show you how to get the log archive. And if we output to plain text, we're going to get anywhere from 2 to 9 gigs. I'd say 9 gigabytes is on the high end for a heavily used system like mine. For less used systems, it'll be in the lower gigabyte level. But definitely a lot of data to work through when we're doing forensics. For comparison, we were looking at Apple system log before and just system.log, the normal system log. We were looking at somewhere in the 40 to 60 megabyte range for both. Somewhere between 200 to 500K records. And then retention for Apple system log, we're seeing a full data set for 7 days. Gives some additional logging that goes back up to a year. Then for system.log, gets about 7 to 14 days, depending on how you configure NCASL-conf. And then you're getting that 200 to 400K record level. But the real, I think, key takeaway here is that previously, if we had a lot of systems to get data for, we could pull out, let's say, 100 Apple system logs. Sure, we would end up with 4 gigs of data, and we could parse through that or work through that slightly painfully, but still possible. But if I had 100 systems to look at for incident response, and they were 9 gigs each for the unified log, parsing through 900 gigs of data becomes substantially, there's substantially more effort required. We need to get into an analysis platform, get a beefier machine, kind of a different approach to go about this. So this is kind of where this talk is going. We're going to talk about how to cut this data down in an effective way so we're not just scrolling through millions and millions of records when we need to find answers quickly.
So we've talked a little bit about the unified log itself, but how do you get the unified log? So there's two ways that you can go about retrieving it. From a forensic standpoint, there's pretty much one main way that we go about that, and that's from a dead disk. So typically investigations will have an image that has been sent to us, and we'll use a tool like Blacklight to go through and pull, in this case, manually pull the UUID text as well as the diagnostics directories. And then from there, we can take both of those folders, we'll put it on a desktop, for example, move both of those directories into an additional folder, and then from there, we'll give it a .log archive extension. Now, what that does is it creates this log archive that is readable for Apple. So once we have that .log archive, we can now use Apple's tools to go through and parse the unified log. Now, the other way you can go about getting the actual log archive is through a live system. And this is much easier. It's pretty much one line. It's sudo log collect. And I'll give a little demo of how easy that can be. Now, this log command that Apple provides does have additional features. In addition to collect, you can also config, erase, show, stream, and stat. The ones that are useful, those commands that are really useful to us are the log collect and the log show. The log stream is going to give you a live view of all the logs that are being generated on the system at the current point in time. There is the observer effect that comes with that, however. So going back to the disk, this is what the actual directories look like. So on the left-hand side, you have your diagnostics directory. Now, this is going to have information such as high volume, persist, signpost, special, and time sync. Now, these are where all your trace V3 files are going to be located. One thing to note, we've not observed any data in the high volume yet. That's still been blank, and we're not quite sure what's going to go there. On the right side, you have your UUID text. This is going to be where your supporting files are. And as you can see, they're in a different format. They're not a .trace v3. They're in this strange randomized character string. So I'm going to skip through these. These are just the help pages. I'm going to go to a little demo of how to actually use the log command. So this is a VM system that I have running. And the command that you're going to want to run is sudo log collect. Now, what this is going to do is generate that .log archive that you can then use to parse through all the unified log data. So you run this, it's going to ask for the password. And in this case, we're going to get an error because it is on a VM. So, but after that, it will run. And in the directory that you were in, you'll see this new system log.archive. Now, this is the unified log. This is the data that you want to use to be able to start parsing through. So parsing unified log, I'll hand it over to Jay.
All right, thanks, Eric. So once we have that log archive, either we use log collect, we pull from the disk, or we use log show and gather plain text data. Our next step is to parse it and get it in a format that we can digest and that we can do analysis on. Because in the .log archive format, it's not really useful to us. I can't just grep that and get answers. We have to transform it in another way to operationalize it and find the bad guy. So here are just a couple methods we've used to look through the unified log. There are more tools out there that you can use to parse it, to cut the data in different ways or visualize it. This is just some of our experience and some of the knowledge we've gathered, so we're sharing this with you today. So the first one is Yogesh Kachari's Unified Log Reader. He put this out, I believe, last year. Python-based tool, open source, available on GitHub pretty easily. Some filtering capabilities, works on multiple platforms, so it's Python-based. We've had a lot of success with it. I think it runs pretty well. This is very good when you have the unified log pulled off of systems. So if you want to gather 100 systems and do some quick analysis and cut the data really quickly, it'll interpret the log archive format, and you'll get plain text results that you can use. Be bored, obviously, it just can generate gigs and gigs of data, just like any other method. So if you have a lot of systems to look at, just be careful as you go about this. The second tool we've used is Blacklight from Blackbag. So when we're doing forensic disk analysis, this integrates really well into the workflows because Blacklight has keyword searching capabilities, it has filtering capabilities, and we can just take a look at it directly after looking at a disk image. There's no need for an export from the disk image or from the UI to get the constituent private part DB diagnostics and UIT text directories. We can just view it in the system logs feature in Blacklight. Obviously, this is a commercial GUI-based application, so there's some licensing required. You need the hardware, and et cetera, along with the disk image to take a look at it. But it does provide some good features for us when we're doing traditional disk forensics. The last one here is the log and log show command, which is native to pretty much every modern version of Mac OS. So it has a lot of filtering capabilities, predicate filtering. We're going to talk about this pretty soon. But this is, I think everyone can leverage it. It's already installed on their Mac. But there's some issues we're going to talk about that come up when you're using log and log show. But these are just our main three tactics for parsing the log. So just comparing the parsing outputs, we wanted to do some validation on some of our test data. So we ran a few cases in our test VMs on bare metal systems, just to make sure that all our different methods were parsing the data correctly. And generally, we're looking at Unified Log Reader and Blacklight. This is just for a test 10.15. This is a 10.14.6 VM that we tested on, reconstructed log archive from the disk directories, and printed a .log archive file. So we got the same results for Unified Log Reader and for Blacklight. The data we expected to be there was there. And when we went to log show, the closest recreation was to do the info and signpost commands. In that case, we only got 6 additional records, which were just time sync entries. This was system boot, so some system clock adjustments. Because we use the VMs to suspend it and do all these strange things with it, system clock adjustments are pretty frequent, actually. But generally, we're seeing the same amount of data between these different methods. And really, the critical data we need for instant response is all there. So we did find this one issue, and when we went out to make this presentation, we weren't actually expecting to find this problem with the log command. But to quickly run through what you're looking at on the screen. So on this VM we were gathering the data from, we suspend it and resume it. In this particular VM, we last suspended it in November of 2019 and started it again on March 1st of this year, just to grab some screenshots. But if you look at the slides here, these are this is the same log parsed through 2 different tools. The first one was log show. And what you'll notice is that the message shows events being written out to a core analytics file. But the core analytics file is dated from March 1st at 15:35 and 10 seconds Pacific Standard Time. But the log show command is showing this as occurring on November 6th, 2019. When we push this through Unified Log Reader, we're getting the correct date of March 1st, 2020 at 23:35:10 UTC. And we went back through the data, and this really initially came up because I was looking through the data and realized there were no March 1st events. I know we had resumed the VM on March 1st, the system clock was adjusted, I would wholly expect events to be written for that time frame, and the log show parsing showed no events for that date. And this is only one example. There are multiple events that have a message that contain the date of the event as well. And there's a significant mismatch where we see March 1st in the message, but the timestamp from log show shows us November 6th, 2019. So we're still trying to characterize this. This is a pretty, I'd say, relatively recent development for us as we've gone through this. I think it's kind of maybe shaken some of our fundamental assumptions about Apple's first-party tools. So we'll try to understand this, I think, to the full extent and characterize the boundaries of this and get a bug report out there so this can get fixed. But I think this really goes to show, one of the lessons from forensics and its response is use multiple tools. When we start comparing our outputs against multiple tools, this is what happened. Sometimes the tool you trusted and assumed worked, in a new situation or a new case just simply doesn't work the way you think it does. So we're going to keep digging into this little issue here and see if we can fully characterize it.
All right, so we've gone over the unified log, how to acquire it, and the next step is actually going through and filtering down to the data that you're looking for. So we have, as forensicators, an old faithful approach, and that's constantly just grepping through everything. It's reliable, it always works, but it does have some drawbacks. One, it's slow. Now, in the way we would be grepping the unified log, we would output everything to its own text file, and that text file can range from anywhere from 1 gig to 9 gigs, and that takes a while to both parse through, as well as if you have system storage constraints, that could be an issue there. And then in terms of syntax, when you're grepping, you don't know if you're always using the correct syntax. with predicates and predicate filtering, that does help you out a little bit. So in terms of narrowing down the information we're looking for, there is filtering. Now, there's two ways that you can filter. You can filter with the log collect command, which is the one I talked about and demonstrated earlier. Or you can also use the log show command. Now, we recommend using the log show. As log collect, if you start filtering from when you're collecting that information, you're not getting the full picture and everything from the log. You're narrowing your scope, and that could be detrimental if you have events that start ranging outside of that scope. So the log show command is what we use to go and parse and really filter down that .log archive file. And there's a bunch of different options that we could use. So typically what I'll use is the ---- backtrace, debug, info loss, signpost. That just includes all those logs to make sure we're getting as much information as possible. And the other two types of filtering are by size and by timeline. Now, size isn't used too often, usually only if you have a size constraint. But the timeline is very effective, especially if you've identified an incident or an event of interest, and then you can pivot from that time frame and narrow down on the events around that. And rather than using the entire timeline that you'll just have a subset, which makes it a lot easier to go through all that data. And the other type of filtering that we use is predicate filtering. Now, predicate filtering you can think of as keyword searching, essentially. And so I have an example to kind of demonstrate what this is. So we have our user1 unified log.log archive. And again, as a reminder, that is our unified log that has been compressed in a way that we can now view it. So we use the log show command here in red to then parse through that log archive. We include the ---- info, backtrace, debug, etc. to include all that data that we have. And then we get to the blue here. And so this is where we start our predicate filtering. So in this particular instance, we're using the predicate event message. Now, to simplify things, you can use or think about these predicates, this event message, as basically the log field. Now, they're not exactly one-to-one, but that's the way we go about it. So the event message correlates to the message field that I discussed earlier when I was showing that console view. And so in this case, we're looking for any word remote in that event message. And now once we get there, we'll output this, we'll standard out it to a text file called AUL user1 remote. And now that new text file that we have, rather than being 9 gigs, if it was the entire unified log, we've now filtered down to just events that are remote, and it's something much more manageable. You can now grep through for maybe additional keywords of interest or just scroll up and down depending on the size. So these predicate filtering is extremely powerful. And so here at CrowdStrike, we've built a couple of predicate filters that we use and are pretty much our go-tos. Now, they don't always catch things, but we usually start with, there's 8 of them that we have here. We'll start with these 8, and usually they will give us a little bit of information that we can then pivot on to look for additional evidence of an intrusion. So these first few are pretty simple. First, top left is sudo. That's just going to be any elevated privilege command. You have your login events. TCCD, that's going to be when there are permission or access violation issues. Now, this could be useful if you have one application that's calling another application. So, for example, if you had QuickTime calling terminal, that would be somewhat suspicious. So that's pretty useful to us. And then we have our SSH. SSH from Macs, at least from our standpoint, is one of the most used lateral movement techniques that we see out there. So especially if we're wondering how someone got onto a box, this is where we look at. Now with predicate filtering, you can get a little more advanced. You can start including some logic in there. As you see, you can have an and. So we're looking for both the process equals kextd and the sender equals iokit. With this particular predicate, we're looking for any successful kernel extensions that were added. Now, this is not exactly useful anymore, but it shows an example. And the other 3 are screen sharing, looking for session creation destruction events. That's what we're going to look for if you want to see what occurred and maybe the time frame of the session, as well as the keychain DB unlock. So now we've gotten through both all what the unified log is, how to acquire it, and how to now filter down. So we want to provide a mock scenario that we've created. It's based off of what we've seen in the real world. This is not actually client data. And we want to go through how we would solve this type of investigation. So typically what we'll get a call from a client, and they will give us some background on what occurred. Usually it's very brief and it's not detailed at all. So in this case, the client has reached out and they've identified that their user has noticed that the strange events were occurring on November 4th, 2019. The user reported that their Mac was running slow and that an unknown application had requested them to type their password in multiple times. So we would get this type of information and then use and go to the unified log to see if we can dig a little deeper and find out what actually occurred. So I'm going to hand it over to Jay as he's going to conduct the investigation.
All right, thanks, Eric. So it's worth noting when we do one of these investigations, as part of our job, we would pull a full disk image, we would look at a number of forensic artifacts. But what we're showing you here is really the power of the unified log, how we can uncover a lot of the investigation from one forensic artifact source. Just by parsing one single log, we can get a lot of answers quickly for the customer. So like Eric said, the user reported the Mac was running slow, unknown application prompted them to enter their password and they entered it, who knows why. So we're going to take a look at the unified log and look at a couple screenshots to see what has occurred here. And just to reiterate what he said, for those of you maybe my customers, this is not any of your data. This is no customer data. This is just simulated based off of what we've seen in the field. So hopefully you guys can see this showing well up here. So looking for the predicates that Eric introduced in the previous slides, the first thing we're taking a look at is SSHD. So we look at SSHD, we see some SSH connections. We see these connection closed events, accepted, interactive for a certain user, from an IP address, and port provided. In this scenario, we would talk to the user, say, do you expect SSH out, or do you expect an inbound SSH? And they'll probably also consult with the IT team for the organization to understand, is SSH part of the normal workflow? And if so, what would be indicative of it? What IPs would you be coming from? Which accounts would you be using? In this case, we'll say that the user and the IT team confirmed SSH should not be used in the environment. Somehow they've left it on, enabled on the system. So we see this inbound connection. We have now an atomic indicator, this IP address. We know they've been using this account, John, and we know that there's disconnect events. So we have a general time frame now. We know there's SSH in play. We know they probably have user credentials from at least one account, just based off of this activity. So from here, we can do additional predicate filtering, and we can do additional pivoting to understand what else has occurred. But we have some key time frames of interest, which is now November 4th, 2019, about 2,200 hours and 2,240 approximately, and we can do some additional pivoting from here. So another key thing we look at is sudo. With sudo command, you can run things with elevated permission. You can accomplish a lot more than the standard user permissions. So if we take a look here, we see user root looking, running who am I? For those of you who did responsive investigations or even red teaming, who am I is a very powerful tool to understand your user context, understand what are you once you get into an environment. So we see that's a little suspicious. Then we see these get remote login events under system setup, which probably is also not good for running under sudo. And then we finally see automatic being run to capture all the data from the system. So this is a case where we see this actually frequently in the real world, where the user has been compromised may also be used for incident response, unbeknownst to the organization or the victim that they may be trampling in some of the forensic data by using the same account. So from here, we have to be very careful and discern what occurred via the threat actor and what occurred via the IT team. So what can help us here is we see the automatic command being run almost a day later, so maybe when the incident was detected, so we can differentiate that from the attacker's actions. Also, I've never seen an attacker run automatic. If they did, that'd be something special. If you guys ever see that, let me know. But from here, we have some more leads. We're building up the time frame a little bit further. So in the 2,200 hour time frame, we see these commands on November 4th. So we know there's something going on during this time frame, and we need to look a little bit deeper into what's going on. So this one's probably the hardest one to see, but we have so look at screen sharing. And surprisingly, when we do our incident response investigations, we see threat actors use screen sharing sometimes, even if they have SSH capability, even if they have a route they're using. Sometimes they just look like good old-fashioned screen sharing. I'm not really sure why. Maybe they like the GUI, maybe it makes them feel comfortable. It's their prerogative. We're the ones that get to investigate it. So we've actually had to go through this analysis realistically a lot to go look for screen sharing events. Sometimes even for system administration using things like TeamViewer, we've seen organizations use native Mac screen sharing, Apple Remote Desktop, etc., just to do administration. So sometimes we have to pick out these screen sharing events we're seeing out of legitimate activity. So that's where we have to rely on the organization or the victim to provide us information on what accounts are we legitimately using, what IP should it be coming from, so that we can narrow this down and understand what's bad. We'll say for this scenario, the IT team and the user did not confirm any legitimate use of screen sharing. So in this case, we can say everything about screen sharing is bad. So we're able to get from the log, initially here, as you can see at the top, is the initial screen sharing event just before 2200 hours on the 4th. So we have essentially screen sharing starting up. You have authentication succeeded from a particular IP address with a guest request for control. It looks like in this case, the user did provide that control. I'm not really sure why, but once again, their prerogative. And it runs for a while, and you can see if you look, it runs for about 11 minutes, 12 minutes. We finally see the screen sharing exit out. You see these messages. So this block of messages you're going to see here is pretty much standard when the screen sharing session ends, and you're going to get a message saying finally no viewers, so time to exit. So we see this happen twice, so we know that the screen sharing has occurred via screen sharing D for 2 periods for the unified log, each comprised for about a few minutes each. I think the first one was about 11 minutes. Second one is it's probably another 30 or so minutes, maybe a little bit less. So we now have an extended time frame. We know there's data earlier. We know there's data a little bit later. So we know these are our bounds. We know that there's SSH. We know there's screen sharing. We know there's pseudo activity. So we know we need to keep digging further. So then probably our next step here is using that screen sharing D information and our time frame, we can start piecing together what has occurred on this system. So we've zoomed in a little bit here, but essentially we've timelined it. So starting in the 2200 hour, you see this SSH connection closed, then you see this reconnect, disconnect again, and some screen sharing starting again for user John. So we've seen John being used for SSH, we've seen John being used for screen sharing. So at that point, we can probably ostensibly say that the threat actor has credentials for the user. If they're able to use the account via 2 different methods, we have a general time frame. We know they ran who am I multiple times for some reason. And we can keep digging a little bit further. But we can narrow down our focus here. And if we wanted to reacquire data or look at other systems, now we have a time slice we can use. So we have predicates that we can use, we have a time slice that we can use, we can dig deeper. This one's also a lot of data. So this is when we say unified log is a lot of records, we got to parse it, this is why. So you kind of narrowed it down here a little bit, but what you're seeing is, under the context of the far root user, you're seeing ifconfig being run. So that's interesting. How is it being used? Why is it running ifconfig? We saw who am I being run before, screenshot SSHD, but we're still putting the pieces together. This is still right at the same time from about 2240 UTC on that day, and we can see that there is ifconfig, which is also something that Fractor uses frequently to understand network settings, IP address, maybe what part of the network they're in, once they're in. So then we start pivoting from there. We have the time frame, we have some commands, and we see this interesting thing is ESD. So we see the ifconfig test run, we see these remote login events. I guess the Fractor loves ifconfig in this case. But essentially, for those of you who are not familiar with this is Eggshell. It's a host exploitation framework that's available on GitHub. For this scenario, we use this. We didn't really want to use the Fractor's custom tools we can counter our investigations. Probably not the best idea. But those of you who have used it, Eggshell writes out a bunch of data to the unified log. So if you do an investigation that involves it, or you just want to play around on your own system, these are the kind of events you're going to get. So from here, we have this idea, okay, at the top we have ifconfig running under the context of the John user. But then as we go down, we have things running under the context of far roots. So what's happening behind the scenes is that using Eggshell, we prompted the user for their password. They provided it, and we were able to escalate privileges from the Eggshell tool. So at that point, we have elevated privileges. We can run whoami again, we can run ifconfig, we can run all kinds of things, and continue exploitation of the system. But from the unified log, we're able to see a number of things that occur. Knowing the log source in the system has provided us this kind of detail. So it's been really useful, and we're kind of able to understand what occurred here. So just to wrap things up, and then we'll have a question Q&A after this. What we've gone through is what the unified log is, how it can be useful in an incident response investigation, what its functions are, how to acquire it, how to parse it using various tools, including the native log show command, which as we found out may actually be flawed, using third-party tools, which also work quite well to get us the data, and really how to narrow down your scope and find people faster. This talk is probably the culmination of years of research on our side to understand how to use it. Because when we first encountered, I think 3 years ago or so, it was kind of a mystery to us, right? Pivoting from Apple system log and system.log to this whole new logging format. How do we make sense of it? And eventually we just used our nights and weekends to come up with this presentation. As you know, instant response we're pretty busy. So using our nights and weekends to get everything together and hopefully provide you a pretty useful view of what's out there and how to leverage it. One more thing we have, so Automatic, we are going to release a module for this soon. The bug we identified log show has thrown a wrench into some of our plans. So we're still working on trying to understand the extent of the bug and characterize it to make sure that the data in Automatic is not flawed, in the same way that it's not flawed for the log show. So look out for this. We're going to do the Aloha arm raid later with the tool, but this module will come out later once we make sure that there's no problems with the data quality. But that is it. That's all we have on our side. I'll open it up for any questions anyone has about unified log, parsing, meaning of life, really take anything. I might not have an answer, but yeah.
Do you guys ever, as you're going through logs, unified log as a developer, you can mark certain parts of your log as private or redacted. Do you guys face challenges when you're going through log where you come across stuff like that where it affects your ability to understand what's going on? For the most part, we have the context with kind of timestamps and just what's happening.
Yep, sure, I'll start. So I think we have enough data from at least from a forensics perspective, right? So if an application is running, we're getting the timestamps associated with it, especially if there's signposts associated with that program. Generally, I would say we're looking for evidence of execution. So if there's a particular piece of malware, a particular third-party application that's running, like TeamViewer. As long as we have evidence of execution, that helps us build the time frame. And then we also leverage a lot of the native Apple system utilities, looking at login or screen sharing D or looking at CAX. Those still provide enough context from a first-party utility perspective. Now, if everything that was redacted or private was available to us, maybe we'd have more context and more understanding. But I think we generally do get enough. The big problem is when the threat actor runs log erase -- all. That is when we have nothing left. Some threat actors may backspace on wise to it and run that, and we have no basis for a unified log investigation.
Just to further that answer, with those 8 predicate filterings that we have, we rarely see private being thrown in there. And those are, again, the core 8 that we use. So it doesn't affect us.
Sure. So we're trying to avoid doing that. So on a per system basis, it's not too bad. We have to parse out the unified log and then one graph. But if you mistype something, you can run it again. You're waiting. And then sometimes you get a huge number of results even from the graph. You have to keep winnowing that down to something useful. And the problem comes when we have an incident. Let's say I think we had one where we had 4,000 systems. That doesn't really work. You can't run 4,000 systems with a multi-gig log per system. It's not an effective solution. So that's where we have to get more creative and come up with these filtering solutions and other techniques to get to it. Because I don't know if you tried running 3 terabytes of data, I can't even fit that on my Mac. So.
Yeah, so the old syslog has like this remote syslog thing which uses like correlated bubble log. Is there any corollary for the unified log, or is there a folder that it sends to some master system? Like, are you had to deal with that investigation?
No, we have not dealt with that from an investigation perspective. Usually our customers don't have a lot of systems out. We're pulling it from the system by system basis, which I think kind of formed the basis of this talk, why we have to grab from each system and do this processing. If everything was forwarded to one place, that'd be nice. But even then, I think that just the sheer amount of data might be too much for some organizations to handle. So, I think one of the things we've thought about from a recommendation perspective is putting some predicate filtering into those key events and forwarding that off or saving that on a per system basis. So there's a manageable set of data that we can use later if there's an investigation. I mean, ideally, as forensic managers, we take all the data from every system at all times, but sometimes there's a limited feasibility for that. Question back there.
Do you have a sense of how much data streaming there would be using those filters?
How much data would be streamed? So the question is how much data would we collect if we use this filter per device?
I mean, it depends on the activity on the computer, right? If if you have a developer always using sudo, there's gonna be a lot of sudo commands. If screen sharing is used, yeah, it depends on the activity.
I think with our 8 predicates we identified, and probably a few additional ones we had, I think it's probably 10 megs.
Yeah.
That you can cut the data down to. So something a little bit more manageable than gigs of data.
And there's ways to filter. So I'm gonna use sudo as an example. I don't know if I can go to it. For sudo, we cut out a lot of the additional pseudo data. So all those dots were additional data that came up from that result that we just didn't find relevant for this presentation. But if you see here, there's a command equals. You could also use an additional predicate filter to look for that command, and that would give you just these. So again, if you narrow down that predicate filtering, you can get just real tight and compact data of what you're looking for. Not typically. Usually we just want to get that initial data, those messages. So for screen sharing, we want to see that successful authentication in that time frame, just to get that quick win. Now, if we wanted to dive deeper to see if there were any other processes kicked off or around, that's when we'd use it. But again, typically it's just, oh, that's the event, that's that authentication, that's the time frame, and we move on.
And to echo what Eric said, sometimes when we're doing instant response, trying to move quickly, sometimes it's just a lead generating activity for us. So we can quickly go through, get some leads, and then pivot to there and look at process trees and look at what else is coming from there. That's what we can also pursue. I think this example is pretty simplistic in some of the techniques to use, so that's why we can figure out a lot just from very simple predicate filtering. But some of our threat actors are pretty advanced and we're going to do some pretty deep analysis.
I'm an attacker, technically speaking. What do I do to ensure that I show up in response?
You run log array sol. So if you run log array sol, we didn't include a screenshot of this, but the first line of the log will say log array sol that has been run. So it's pretty effective. I mean, unless we can get the data from the APFS snapshot or some other source. We've gone to investigations where it's just gone. And we have to use system.log, ASL, other artifacts, so look at MRUs. Yeah, that's where we start struggling. When everything's in one log, you have one log to rule them all, and then you throw it into order and it's all gone. What are you going to do?
In the cases where it's gone, the attackers remove it?
Yes. Yeah, we've had some attackers really wise up to this technique and just erase it.
Maybe listening is not.
I think the question was back there first.
Not exactly questions, but very well questions. People do a live stream, just asking questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry.
So, just like what percentage of threat actors out there are using all the logs?
Okay, so the question is, what percentage of threat actors are leaking the logs? So if you do Windows investigations, you'll see it's pretty frequently, unfortunately. In Mac, I would say, if I had to take a percentage cut, I'd say like 15% of attackers are wise up to deleting logs on Mac. Question?
Any more to delegate, like getting suspending a process while they're in, presuming it needs, so it's not as obvious.
So the question is there anything more elegant where they're suspending or restricting processes as they do their operations?
Yeah, like the line lead.
I haven't observed that directly. I don't think we've observed it. I mean, we have that built-up monitoring tool, and I don't think we've seen any threat actors from that perspective doing it. I don't think we picked that up from the forensic investigation, but maybe they have to do now.
Sorry, I'm impressed with it.
Question back there, yeah?
So if I was a black hat and I really wanted to see, I would delete only those things I need. Is there a script that allows me to do that?
So the question is, because I was a black hat, I wanted to, if there's a script to delete specific things from the log, correct? I don't think, I think conceivably you could go through the trace-v3 files and try to parse them. So you can parse individual trace-v3 files using the log show command. you could conceivably pick out individual files that have your commands and evidence of your attack and try to delete those individually. I haven't seen anyone do that. Usually the practitioner just go with the bludgeon approach and go for log and resolve. But I think it's an interesting thing. I'd probably research that now.
Ideally, one of those pick those 6 commands you just highlighted and reveal nothing else.
So the comment was, why not just take those commands we highlighted and delete all the entries? That's a good idea. Sounds like you're the black hat already. No, I think it's fantastic. I actually probably do some additional research to see how to cut out specific events. I think we've just been stuck with log and resolve up to this point, but I think that's interesting to pursue.
Again, if that were to happen, we would look at additional artifacts. Save state for terminal would probably still have that data there that we go through if you were using command line.
Anyone else?